One of the most infamous United States political rivalries from the last 100 years centers around the short-lived Kennedy administration. It's not about John F. Kennedy and his Republican opponent Richard Nixon, or any Republican for that matter. In fact, the rivalry wasn't even about President Kennedy himself. It involved his brother and his vice president. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy shared a mutual hatred. This might be obvious enough by the nicknames each had for the other. Kennedy called Johnson Uncle Rufus or Rufus Cornpone in reference to his crude speech, lumbering posture, and lack of class. Johnson called Kennedy a grandstanding runt and a snot-nosed kid. For the good of the Democratic Party, they kept the drama behind the scenes, but to anyone around them, it was no secret. Kennedy was even gifted a voodoo doll of Johnson, which he happily stabbed with pins. At face value, it might be easy to blame it on the dynamic. Johnson had been Senate Majority Leader, called the second most powerful man in the country in the days of Eisenhower, and now he was Vice President. A notoriously useless role. Meanwhile, Robert Kennedy, who was nearly 2 decades younger, was Attorney General and the president's closest advisor, seemingly for no good reason other than he was the president's brother. But the hatred started much further back. It might have even started all the way back in 1940. Late that year, President Franklin D. Roosevelt fired Ambassador Joe Kennedy, Robert's father. 32-year-old Congressman Johnson was with Roosevelt when he made the decision to fire, quote, that son of a bitch. Robert Kennedy was only 15 at the time, but he no doubt heard the story passed around as Johnson loved retelling it. For Kennedy, it was a humiliating blow to the father he admired. For Johnson, it was a funny story of a rich snob getting his comeuppance. It earned Johnson hatred from young Kennedy. And as Joe said of his own son, once Bobby hates you, you stayed hated. 13 years later, in 1953, they met for the first time in the Senate cafeteria. Young Kennedy was just working as an assistant to Senator Joseph McCarthy. Well entrenched in his political career, Johnson had already been a Texas senator for 4 years and had just been elected Senate Minority Leader earlier that month. Biographer Robert Caro describes the scene. As Johnson, Bubsy, and Reedy walked by, McCarthy, as was his custom, jumped up to shake Johnson's hand, calling him, as senators were already starting to do, leader, and McCarthy's staffers also rose, except, quite conspicuously, for Bobby, who sat unmoving with a look on the face that Bubsy described as a sort of glower. Lyndon Johnson knew how to handle that situation. Moving around the table, he extended his hand to McCarthy and those of the standing staffers, and, when he got to Bobby Kennedy, stood there, with his hand not exactly extended, but in Bubsy's words, sort of half-raised, looking down at Kennedy. For a long moment, Kennedy didn't move. The glower had deepened into something more. Bobby could really look hating, Bubsy says, and that was how he looked then. He didn't want to get up, but Johnson was kind of forcing him to, and finally, without looking Johnson in the eye, he stood up and shook his hand. When later asked what all the drama was about, Johnson simply said, "It's about Roosevelt and his father." He knew exactly why Kennedy hated him, but he probably never thought that a decade later he'd still be dealing with this thorn in his side. At the 1960 Democratic National Convention, John F. Kennedy won the nomination, and one of the defeated was Lyndon Johnson. To Johnson, this was ridiculous. He was the Senate Majority Leader and one of the most powerful and skilled politicians in Washington. Yet he lost to someone he considered to be a political lightweight. As Johnson saw it, 2 things got Kennedy as far as he was: Daddy's money and his public appeal, meaning good looks, charisma, good speaking ability, friendliness, and likability, all advantages which Johnson was well aware he never had. In no small part, Kennedy's triumph was due to Western delegates swinging away from Johnson. thanks to some politicking from Kennedy's brother Edward and his other brother, Robert. The Kennedys offered Johnson the role as running mate to balance the ticket. Johnson accepted, but wasn't happy. At 51, with over 2 decades in politics, he was playing second fiddle to some rich pretty boy. This might explain the general animosity between the Kennedys and Johnson, but it doesn't explain the exceptional animosity between LBJ and RFK. In looking for an explanation, anecdote upon anecdote can be brought up. In 1956, Joe Kennedy secretly offered Johnson financial backing to help him win the nomination if Johnson chose John Kennedy as his running mate. Johnson turned him down. Robert found this disrespectful. In 1960, Johnson's campaign tried to make an issue out of Kennedy's Addison's disease, which infuriated Robert. And then there's the White House dynamic of Johnson having to watch Robert with the president's ear every single day while he struggled for the little time he got. But ultimately, the hatred between Kennedy and Johnson came down to personalities. As Johnson's press secretary George Reedy put it, "Did you ever see 2 dogs come into a room, and all of a sudden the hair rises on the back of their necks, and there's this low growl? That's the way they responded to each other the first time they met." Kennedy was the third of 4 boys, and the 7th of 9 children. Smaller and weaker than his brothers, he was sometimes teased, but more often ignored. Perceiving young Robert as soft and compassionate, their father also took little interest in him. Quiet and awkward by nature, Kennedy was the kind of kid who, in his own words, didn't mind being alone. He liked United States history, but otherwise wasn't too interested in school, and wouldn't conform to fit in with social cliques, so he mostly kept to himself. However, he had a strong sense of virtue, which pushed him out of his comfort zone. He especially hated bullying, and wanted to stop injustice wherever he saw it. Because of this, he began developing a harder edge. But what may have been an even greater motivator was the desire for attention from his father. He began taking life more seriously and pushing himself more, and it paid off. By the time Robert was a young man, his father described him as hard as nails. Johnson was almost the exact opposite. He was the eldest child with 3 sisters and 1 brother. At best, he took his siblings for granted, and at worst, he bullied them. When he was very young, he admired his successful father, but after his father lost his wealth, Johnson felt humiliated and resented him. To say Johnson was outgoing would be an understatement. He always needed to be the center of attention, and he'd stoop to any level to get there, whether that meant sucking up to authority, being loud and bombastic, being cruel, or, if nothing else worked, even humiliating himself. The latter became all too common after his father went broke. It ultimately sent him on a spiral of cruel and sometimes criminal and violent behavior as a young adult. But in the end, this just led to more humiliation. Eventually, there was one thing he desired more than just attention: power. In contrast to the hard-as-nails Kennedy, the college-aged Johnson was becoming the perfect suck-up, making good relations with popular students on campus, literally sitting at the feet of professors, doing anything to put him in the favor of people with power, and make sure he'd never be on the bottom again. Their paths to power marked just how different they were. Kennedy, a crusading attorney fighting corruption, communism, and sometimes even his own allies in pursuit of his vision of justice. And Johnson, the consummate politician, shaking the right hands, learning how to read people, getting on the good side of the most adept politicians, and figuring out how to use the system to utterly destroy anyone who got in his way. For a stark comparison, Kennedy resigned from McCarthy's committee after 6 months as he wasn't willing to conform with McCarthy's values, or, as he saw it, lack thereof. In contrast, compromise was the name of the game for Lyndon Johnson. He'd gotten so far by basically sucking up to every powerful figure around him, and once he got power, he used intimidation or flattery, whichever worked, to make sure the people beneath him compromised. Biographer Robert Caro elaborates, "There was Bobby's hatred for liars, and his feeling that Lyndon Johnson lies all the time, lies even when he doesn't have to lie. There was his hatred for yes men, and for those who wanted to be surrounded by yes men, and Johnson's insistence on being surrounded by such men, an insistence which Bobby was to say, quote, makes it very difficult unless you want to kiss his behind all the time. He detested the politician's false bonhomie, and Johnson embodied that bonhomie. Kennedy hated Johnson so much that he even tried to stop him from accepting the vice presidential nomination. At the 1960 Democratic National Convention, the Kennedys did make the offer to Johnson, but there's speculation about their true intentions. Some believe that they thought Johnson was too prideful to actually accept the position. Thus, the offer would be left as a sign of good faith, a way to make sure a spiteful Johnson wouldn't be using his political sway against them. Surprisingly, Johnson was open to the idea. While John's feelings about having Johnson actually accept the position are unknown, Robert never came to terms with it. 3 times in one day, he tried to get Johnson to turn down the offer. The first 2 times he met with Johnson's campaign officials. The third, he met alone with Johnson. While most politicians shuddered at the thought of being locked alone in a room with Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy was practically breaking down the door to get inside. No one knows what happened in that room. That information died with both men. What is known is that Johnson became John Kennedy's running mate, and that Robert and Johnson continued hating each other. And Robert Kennedy continued to be confrontational with Johnson. He perhaps learned to pick his battles better and go along for the good of the party, but during his brother's administration, he belittled and tormented Johnson, or Uncle Rufus, in every way he could, and during Johnson's administration, he never showed the unconditional deference that Johnson wanted from everyone. In a phone call from July 1964, Kennedy even outright accused Johnson of receiving reports on him. Kennedy couldn't really argue with Johnson on many domestic issues, as Johnson was honoring John's legacy by taking on more liberal stances, such as pushing through the Civil Rights Bill. In fact, because of his unparalleled political skill, Johnson was probably able to get more legislation passed than Kennedy ever could have. There were social issues where he was at odds with Johnson's administration. However, he really found his issue to legitimately oppose Johnson with the Vietnam War. Johnson and Kennedy were just too different to ever get along, and their one similarity, each man's absolute need to have his own way, guaranteed they'd be bitter rivals. Even after John Kennedy's assassination, the shadow of Robert loomed over Johnson for the next 5 years, as Johnson was well aware of Robert's tenacity and popularity, and lived in perpetual fear, and some might say paranoia, of being usurped in the 1968 election. Robert's assassination that year left Johnson no better. Despite all of his accomplishments, the public would always remember the Kennedy brothers better. Though many historians have since been more positive towards Johnson, public opinion of the time made him feel like a failed president. He died in 1973, 4 years after leaving office, still in the shadow of the Kennedys. If one thing can be said for both Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, it's that no matter how begrudgingly, they recognized the capability of the other. "I can't stand the bastard," Robert once said, "but he's the most formidable human being I've ever met." For his 1960 campaign, Johnson later admitted that he picked his campaign manager because he was the only man tough enough to handle Robert Kennedy. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing and donating on Patreon. Donations from $2 to $15 a month help towards more frequent uploads and help towards the frequency of more in-depth topics like this one. Patreon link in the description below.